There definitely seems to be some friction between the generations these days, especially the millennials and Gen Z versus like Gen X and the boomer generation. Like the millennials, like my generation and Gen Z, a lot of us think, not myself, but think that a lot of the problems caused today were done by Gen X and the boomers. But then the Gen X and boomers say that, it's because millennials and Gen Z are like lazy, they don't work hard enough, they make the wrong choices. So I don't know how this is going to get settled.
Generational war happening right now, and it is extremely loud. In fact, it's the reason why I created this channel. Why are they like that? Boomers versus millennials, Gen Z versus everyone, TikTok versus Facebook, skinny jeans versus wide leg, avocado toast versus the housing market. The arguments are everywhere, they generate enormous amounts of engagement, and approximately every generation is involved in them at high volume. Except one. There's a generation sitting to the side of all of this, watching it unfold, occasionally rolling their eyes, mostly not getting involved. Not because they have nothing to say, not because they don't have opinions, but because they have spent their entire lives being trained by circumstance to regard this kind of noise as largely not worth their time. That generation is Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980, currently aged somewhere between 45 and 61, and by any measurable standard, the most consistently overlooked, least discussed, least complained about, least complained to generation in living memory. A poll went around social media a few years ago asking people to vote on the most ignored generation. The options were Gen Z, Millennials, Baby Boomers, and the silent generation. Gen X wasn't even on the poll.
That's
about
interesting. Right. So, why is Gen X so, forgotten about? Why is that?
My name is Eddie Freeman. Every week on this channel, we look at why generations see the world differently, and sometimes why one generation barely shows up to the conversation at all. Why are they like that? Subscribe and you'll get a new one every week.
The latchkey kids.
To understand Gen X's relationship with the generational debate, you have to understand what kind of childhood produced them. Gen X grew up as latchkey kids. That term has softened over time into something that sounds almost nostalgic, but the reality behind it was pretty blunt. Divorce rates peaked in the early 1980s, just as the oldest Gen Xers were hitting their teenage years. Both parents working became the new normal. Childcare infrastructure hadn't caught up yet, so an enormous number of Gen X children came home from school to an empty house.
But what age were they coming home alone? Surely not from age 6 or 7. Are we talking 10, 11 years old?
Let themselves in with the key around their neck and figured out the afternoon on their own. They made themselves snacks. They did, or didn't do, their homework. They sorted out whatever needed sorting. Nobody was checking on them. Nobody was hovering. The parenting philosophy of the era, to the extent there was one, was roughly, you'll figure it out. And they did. They had to. This wasn't a trauma narrative. For most Gen Xers, it was just Tuesday. You came home, you watched MTV, you made a mixtape, you handled your life. The independence was so total and so early that it stopped feeling like independence and started feeling like just how things work.
You'd get used to that pretty quick. If you've been doing that for 6 months, a year, eventually it just becomes normal.
That early self-sufficiency calcified into something permanent. By the time Gen X reached adulthood, they were arguably the least needy generation in American history.
Wow.
Not because of some superior character trait, but because they had been practicing being on their own since they were 10. Then they got to the culture and found it wasn't really for them either. The boomers had owned the cultural conversation since the 1960s. Woodstock, the counterculture, Vietnam, civil rights. Enormous, historic, loudly narrated events that boomers attached their entire identity to. The media was fascinated with boomers. The advertising industry was fascinated with boomers. The political class was boomers. Gen X arrived to find the conversation already full. There were 77 million boomers taking up most of the oxygen. So Gen X did what it was trained to do. Shrugged, found its own lane, and got on with things.
I have to say, that whole attitude of just getting on with it and just, dealing with it, I think is one of the most underrated attributes someone can have. Like, I get it, life isn't fair and things aren't perfect, but I feel like a lot of people these days could just use a bit of like, it is what it is. You got to adjust. I know it's hard, but I think it's such a good trait to have.
The cultural products Gen X produced reflected exactly this. Slacker, Clerks, Reality Bites, The Breakfast Club, the entire alternative rock movement of the early 90s, all of it was drenched in a particular kind of dry, ironic, low expectation worldview. These were not idealists making art about changing the world. These were people who had watched the idealists of the previous generation make a lot of noise and were deeply skeptical that any of it actually added up to anything.
Right.
The word whatever as a cultural response to provocation, that was Gen X's contribution to the English language.
It's like shrug.
And it was not accidental. It was a posture developed over years of being told things mattered enormously and quietly deciding they probably didn't.
The millennial leapfrog.
Then came the millennials.
Yep.
Gen X had barely gotten settled into adulthood when 83 million millennials started entering the workforce, bringing with them a cultural volume that made even the boomers look quiet. Suddenly, everything was about millennials, their expectations, their avocado toast, their student debt.
Avocado, it's awful. Do you like avocado toast? I've tried it once and it just doesn't taste of anything. I don't know why people like it so much.
Their relationship with participation trophies, their burnout, their therapy, their feelings about their feelings. Gen Xers, who had been waiting their turn, who had quietly watched boomers cling to power through their 50s and 60s while expecting to eventually step into leadership, found themselves getting leapfrogged. The boomers were still there, the millennials were right behind them. And the media, the advertising world, and the cultural conversation had essentially decided to skip straight from one to the other. A Gen X writer summarized this with characteristic precision. We've created all these great websites that now millennials waste their lives on. Built the platform, didn't get the credit. That's a very Gen X experience. By the time Gen Z arrived and the OK Boomer Wars began, Gen X had been through 2 complete cycles of this. They had watched themselves get ignored while one generation ahead and one generation behind fought for the microphone. Their response was, appropriately, not to fight for the microphone.
But do you guys think, though, that like Gen X, so Gen X people were born between 65 and 80. So by the early 2000s, they were like working age, like 20 years old at least. And property prices back then were just so much more affordable compared to today. So I suppose that's quite a big advantage for Gen X to have compared to my generation. Or do you think that's a bit overblown?
The generational war that's currently consuming boomers and millennials and Gen Z is, at its core, a war about who gets to be understood. Boomers want credit for what they built. Millennials want recognition for what they've had to deal with. Gen Z wants someone to acknowledge that the world they're entering is harder than the one previous generations got. All 3 of those are genuine desires for validation. All 3 require a certain degree of public performance. The complaint, the clapback, the viral post, the generational hot take. Gen X's entire psychological profile works against that. They don't perform. They are constitutionally allergic to public earnestness. The same culture that produced grunge and irony and whatever is not going to pivot to making TikToks about how they feel overlooked. Complaining loudly about being ignored is the most un-Gen X thing imaginable. If they did it, they'd be embarrassed by themselves. A leadership expert at a conference made a joke that went viral in Gen X circles. She said she had no advice for Gen X for 3 reasons. First, they don't need it. They're the most self-sufficient generation in history.
I mean, but is this whole self-sufficient thing, there must be Gen Xers who, like don't have all the answers. They break down sometimes because they feel lost or they haven't achieved what they want to achieve. Like, is it really like so, like, are they all so independent and self-driven and all that?
Second, even if she had something to tell them, they wouldn't care. Third, even if they did care, they would never admit it. The fact that that joke went viral among Gen X people rather than annoying them tells you everything. They found it funny, they shared it, and then they went back to not caring. There's one more piece of this that doesn't get discussed much. Gen X is currently running things. Quietly, without much fanfare, without the generational brand that boomers wore like a badge and that millennials and Gen Z have built their entire internet identities around, Gen X is actually in charge of a lot. More than half of Fortune 500 CEOs are Gen X. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Satya Nadella, Larry Page, Sergey Brin. The people who built the infrastructure of the digital age and currently run most of it. All Gen X. They also run most of the middle of the economy. They're the managers, the directors, the people who actually execute whatever the boomer bosses decide and translate it for the millennial and Gen Z employees. One workplace expert described Gen X as the bridge generation. They entered a workplace dominated by boomers, adapted to it, then had to turn around and adapt again when millennials flooded in. They've been translating between generations their entire working lives. They are doing this without making it a whole thing. No manifesto, no hot takes, no TikTok series about what it's like to be Gen X in a multi-generational workplace. Just the work.
Yeah, they definitely, like when I think about the Gen X people that I know, they are definitely able to communicate with younger generations and older ones really effectively. Whereas sometimes when I speak to my boomer generation relatives, like they're just unable to sort of see my perspective. Like it's kind of shocking.
The irony at the heart of this episode is that Gen X is actually the generation that most people on this channel should probably pay most attention to. They are the bridge. They have working relationships with every generation in the current workforce. They can talk to boomers because they grew up respecting self-sufficiency and not complaining. They can talk to millennials because they understand economic precarity and they helped build the internet culture that shaped millennial life. They can talk to Gen Z because they genuinely don't care about status and hierarchy in the way that makes younger workers nervous. They're the only generation nobody is fighting with. And the reason nobody is fighting with them is the same reason nobody is fighting about them. They decided a long time ago that the fights weren't worth having. Whether that's wisdom or just very well-practiced indifference is probably the most Gen X question anyone could ask. And if you asked a Gen X person, they'd probably shrug and say, "Does it matter?" Drop it in the comments.
It's going to be so interesting when in about 10 to 15 years time, when my generation become the same age as what the Gen X generation is today, and then Gen X generation becomes as old as the boomer generation is today, if a lot of the attitudes change, you know, because it does seem to happen that like as people get more like as they age and they become more wealthy and their savings and pensions go up, they tend to, their attitudes towards money and stuff and just, you know, the younger generations seems to change. Like I've noticed it in my parents quite a bit. Like when they were younger, they had a bit more, because they were feeling it, that the issues of like affordability and stuff a lot more. They were a lot more sort of like progressive. But as they've gotten older and there's more distance between them and that struggle that they went through when they were younger, they've become a bit more conservative. I wonder if that's going to happen as a whole. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe and check out the video I'm going to link right here.